from our own that is widespread. We've never had that breadth before. GPT-3 is not very different from GPT-4 um, or ChatGPT. The guardrails are nice and important, but it's not that there's a technological revolution, but there's a social revolution here of using these things at such broad scale. And I think what we're seeing is we don't yet know how to control these things, how to regulate them. Something else we found a lot of agreement on that I was pushing is having something like an FDA that might um, you might have to get approval if you do widespread deployment. And Sam had different words, but it was also fairly supportive, and the senators were pretty supportive of that. That's kind of a new idea to treat AI like medicine. I think Michelle Rempel Garner is here, and we should bring her to the stage. She and I wrote a piece in our respective substacks a couple months ago, calling for something like that. That's the kind of new idea to the world. People were receptive to it, which is terrific. But again, getting to a thriving AI future means figuring out how to get the best out of these things without suffering the worst.
So, Gary, my last question, and then Suleiman, we can go to Hans as well. One of the most triggering and contentious questions that we have in this space, and this is going to be another day, I think, where GP and Suleiman lose again. They do not believe that AGI is possible.
Have a good one.
I think
What's
it's
your take?
eminently, or sorry, that's not the right. I think it is certainly possible. I think one can actually have an interesting argument that I think Jan LeCun has mounted that I agree with, which is there are differences, there are varieties of general intelligence. I would say that humans have some degree of general intelligence, but not the optimal general intelligence that you might imagine on first principles. There are limits in how well we transfer knowledge and so forth, but that we're far ahead of machines. But I think that we are biological computers at some level. I see no principal reason why we couldn't have an artificial general intelligence at some point. I think we happen to be looking in the wrong direction. Again, I would agree with LeCun, who I think is really agreeing with what I said, although we want to acknowledge it, that we're not that close. He says we have an off ramp. We're on an off ramp to AGI right now. I would say, deep learning has hit a wall on a certain set of issues about reasoning, planning, etc. They're still unresolved. In that sense, they are a wall. So I don't think we're actually like on that path yet. I think we need some foundational discoveries about how to do reasoning, how to build cognitive models of the world. There's just stuff we haven't figured out yet. We're kind of like in the age of alchemy, where they could kind of smell chemistry off in the distance, but didn't really know how to do it. And that's kind of where we are right now. But that's not a principled reason why we can't do these things. We just have to keep plugging away on them, and hopefully also figure out how to instill values in these machines, and how to have the right regulatory framework around them, and so forth.
So, Gary, I said last question, but I have to follow up with the last one. Besides, if you could just repeat the name of the person that we should bring up so we can invite her up, that would be great.
Michelle Rempel Garner is a Canadian Parliament member, and I guess she's listed here as at Michelle Rempel.
Perfect. The follow-up question, and then I will stop, is, so AGI, is sentience possible, in your opinion?
It might be. We're very vague about what we even mean by that. And even if it's possible, I'm not sure we should do it. It's a really good version of the Jurassic Park. Just because we could doesn't mean we should. Why would we want our machines to do that? I think, we could build machines that understand us well enough to help us and that we could trust without letting them wander off and think about, whether humans should still be there. Like, I don't see the reason to run the risk. I don't see what the value is.
God, I could go forever. So we can't stop technology. So the question is, do you think it's
Well, we could
inevitable?
stop some technologies. I mean, we could, for example, say you must register all large-scale AI systems. You must, if you want to deploy them, do certain kinds of regulatory approval, and that you may not build self-improving systems, and that is against the law, and that will be punishable. Blumenthal, I mean, and you'd have to define self-improving in the right kind of way, but Senator Blumenthal at the end, I think, made the point about enforcement has to go with all of this, and there was not much discussion today. That would be challenging, but we could decide, we've let enough horses out of the barn already, and we don't, or maybe better metaphor, cliche, we let enough genies out of the bottle. Maybe, 3 genies out of 3 bottles is enough, and we don't want to go with the 4th. We could decide that, and if we can't come up with good plans for what we're going to do when we let out the rest of the genies, maybe we should wait on that.
Gary, we need you in these rooms. I've been fighting these discussions for a very long time. Black, you've had your hand up. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, I appreciate it. This is such a fascinating conversation. I find this to be very, very big brain, if you will. The thing is that we're at a point right now where I feel like we're at the metaphorical fork in the road, which I kind of describe it more as like a Schrodinger's cat moment with AI, where you heard it with Elon. Gary just mentioned it as well. I spoke about this even in this space a few weeks back when I was talking about what the proper use cases were going to be in the future. We're at a point where in one direction is doom and gloom and in the other direction is utopia. And I don't think anyone really knows exactly how to get to either one of those. And I think I'm not even sure if, as humans, as a society, and as corporations and technological advancements go, if we even know, if even if we would make that choice, because we seem to be so self-deprecating to a certain degree, right? So to me, it's like it's a very interesting question and time to be alive. The last thing I'll say is something to note as a user of a lot of these AI platforms, as someone who's I've spent hundreds of hours in the last year or two prompting and using. I haven't developed these things with code. I've said it, I've used it. I've had conversations with them, whether through visual applications or through conversational applications. I can tell you that there's two things that are true, and they're both sort of contradictory to one another. One thing that is true is that they're really close to being very human-like, especially on the more LLM side when you have conversations with them back and forth. Like if you sit down, it's not just like a news line or a news headline or something. I mean, if you sit down, you literally spend tens of hours having a conversation with a single thing, you will find that it's really close. But the other thing is that's also true is that it's completely imperfect. It's not perfect. I think as things go along and you have more and more experience with it, you'll find how, as someone mentioned earlier, the kind of hallucination that occurs, and it's because it's making things up as it goes constantly, but it just happens to make things up really accurately most of the time, but it's also making things up as it goes. And this is you can see this through almost every single AI application that's out there right now. And so there's a weird type of balance that I think we have to achieve, whether we want to go into a direction that is realistic and is perfect, as we all kind of, I say we all as in like the technological users and creators tend to seek out this level of perfection in order to achieve that kind of high end level of technological advancement, and or also balancing the things that make it a variable and make it unpredictable. And that's where I see this fork in the road and this Schrodinger's cat, one way is true, one way is not. And that to me is really where the question is. And you can see that same thing echoed through a lot of these conversations.
Thanks for that, Black.
So
I
there's a
appreciate
couple
it.
of things there I might like to respond to. One is just on the point of self-deprecation. One of the things that astonished me about the Senate proceedings was how self-deprecating the Senate was about the Senate in terms of really feeling like they got the internet wrong, and that Section 230 was not the right solution, and that they wanted to do better with AI than they did with the internet. And that really moved me, that they were willing to be kind of intellectually honest about it and say, how do we do this better? So I love that about today's proceedings. On the hallucination point, I will correct you gently and point out that there are some AI systems that don't hallucinate. So, for example, our route planning systems that we use with our GPS to get from point A to point B almost never hallucinate. And it's just a property of large language models that they do, given the way that they assemble information that they've, in some sense, compressed in a lossy fashion, to use a metaphor the New Yorker used. I could go into more technical detail, but fundamentally, they lose track of individual properties. They don't have databases. That might just be the wrong way to build AI. It works if you want to make a chatbot that's fun to play with, but if you want a chatbot you can rely on, I don't think it's the right technology. And I think we're in a kind of local minimum, if you know that phrase, where we're all trying to make these techniques better and to hallucinate less. But it's a fundamental property of how large language models work that they hallucinate. Even if you don't give them, for example, misinformation scraped from Reddit, they'll make up their own misinformation. Like the case I mentioned today was a law professor who was accused of sexual harassment. And the reason he was accused probably is because he had a student who worked with a famous case that involved sexual improprieties with a certain president. And so it was kind of like word chaining, like you get in the telephone game in the system, but it just made it up. There was no actual data to suggest that this law professor was involved in sexual harassment, and it got worse. So the law professor wrote an op-ed about it in USA Today, said, hey, this accused me, defamed me, this didn't happen. Said I was on a field trip in Alaska with a student, I wasn't even in there. It referred to a Washington Post article that didn't exist. This is terrible, we need to worry about it. So he writes this op-ed, and then the Washington Post gets the story, and Will Oremus starts writing about it with Panshu Verma. And the first system was ChatGPT. Then they asked Bing, and Bing said, yeah, the guy was involved in sexual harassment, and it gave a reference, and the reference was the USA Today article that said he was not involved, or op-ed said he was not involved in sexual harassment. So again, it was looking at the statistics of the word, like this guy in sexual harassment, and missing the word not. And in my years before I was working on policy, I was working on AI research and pointed out this problem with negation over and over again. Well, now it's in the real world. I don't think that's going away with these systems. I think we need new architectures to solve it, and I hope we'll get there.
So guys, I think we've only got Gary for another about 15 minutes. So if you've specifically got questions for Gary, or any kind of statements towards Gary, that'd be
I can go to
brilliant.
the end of the hour, 27 more minutes.
Oh, even better. We've got a bit more time. Justin, go ahead.
Gary, so insightful. I watched your testimony. I'm so glad you pressed Sam on his answer to that question. I thought that was really great. I will say, though, after the last 3 years and the complete depletion in trust between the citizenry and its health overlords, what makes you think that we would be amenable to another FDA coming to oversee something that might be even more vital and important? Considering everything they got wrong, from plexiglass to face masks to everything else, right?
I mean, look, we have a history of regulation that is mostly good, that's been really rocky. It was, I think, very poorly managed during COVID, and we could think about all the different political pressures and lack of information and why, and try to do better. But I'm still happy we have seatbelts. I flew commercial here. I'm glad that there were regulations on commercial airlines that made that safe and okay. I don't think we should throw the regulatory baby without the bathwater. I did point out in the hearing today, when they asked what are the things to worry about, the risk of regulatory capture. And one thing we don't want to have is a kind of greenwashing where people basically make policies that protect the incumbents by making it so onerous to do the work that nobody else can get involved, and wind up accomplishing nothing. So like, it's totally non-trivial to get the regulation right. It has to be an iterative process. But again, I'm really glad with my cars and medicines and so forth. I think regulation does work sometimes, and we need to be thinking carefully about what lessons we can learn about where it worked and where it didn't, where people blunder forth and maybe put, one of the things that probably happened last time is there was too much political pressure on what those regulations should be. There were organized misinformation campaigns that we need to think about. There are lots of lessons that I think we can learn, but definitely don't throw the baby out with the bathwater.
But Gary, how do you address, and obviously this is always the fundamental question, the lack of global regulation, right? And it goes back to Elon Musk's signed petition. If we put up bumpers on the bowling alley, we just become worse bowlers.
Well, what I've been lobbying for is an international agency for AI. And one of the arguments I made today in the Senate hearing was that it's not actually in the company's interest to have different regulations for every country. You have 190 some countries. Can you imagine if you had to train a large language model, and maybe each company has to do this for every country, given how much energy is required, and if there are different rules, and you have to do this like regularly to update, for the news and so forth. Like, just the amount of energy would be a disaster, and then the amount of kind of clerical work. Like, it's hard enough to do that, like just around like currency exchange and so forth. And then like it could get worse. Like California and Tennessee could have their own rules about which models you can use. Like, this is not really in the corporate interest. It's not in the interest of the environment. I think there are lots of reasons to try to get together globally. Another reason is, maybe the United States has enough wherewithal to have the right experts that they could come up with the right policies here, maybe. But a lot of countries wouldn't. And putting together our best minds to do this, and also to build research, to build new tools to mitigate the risks. There's lots of reasons to work together here. And the room was super supportive of that, much more so than I expected. I mean, there's a lot of complicated global politics, but almost everybody in the room was solidly behind exploring that idea. And a point that I made was that the U.S. should take the lead on that, and not not follow just whatever the EU does or something like that. Like, we have the talent, we're building the software, we have the resources. Let's take the lead. And I think people were extremely supportive of that.
Gary, I have a question.
Basically,
Let me go
oh, go
to,
ahead.
let me go to Shikar. Shikar, go ahead with your question.
Gary, thanks so much for making time for us. I think we were all, very impressed with really everything that you've done, really across the board.
Okay.
One thing that completely stuck out to me in your synopsis was just the overall optimism on from the policymakers in the room, that this can be something that we address and ultimately hopefully help us get closer to this AI positive reality. Now, I'm fundamentally an AI optimist.
Can I just interject for 1 second?
Yeah.
I wouldn't say that people were positive. I was positive about what happened in the room. I think everybody there was nervous. Everybody there felt like this is important, that we need to tackle it. So in that sense, positive, but not positive in the sense that like people thought this was trivial and that we'd knock it out in a week. Like, nobody left the room thinking that either. Everybody thought we have a real challenge in front of us. It's important, and we're in line to work to it together, which is the best possible outcome given the circumstances. Go on. I just want to clarify that.
No, thank you for clarifying that. That's exactly my point, right? Being willing to work across the aisle and actually make some kind of positive momentum here is, I think, the first step in actually getting this right and not being another Internet 2.0 again. I guess my follow-up question, though, really just rests upon what's possible today versus what we're all thinking about doomsday scenarios for tomorrow. And I know you had some interesting thoughts on how we could potentially regulate creation of like more powerful AI. I think, to your point, and to quote you, right, the genie being out of the bottle is it having mass application today in a way that is honestly pretty hard to monitor for any company that's doing business at the scale of AI, of OpenAI, or really any other infrastructure provider. That's really what concerns me, right? I mean, obviously self-encoding viruses that agents can create is certainly a doomsday scenario. There's a million other doomsday scenarios that rely on more powerful or better technology being out, but that doesn't obscure like mass social engineering purely done using voice manipulation and script generation that is also empowered to do research on every single employee at a company and create a very personalized, relevant social engineering attack. And that has massive ramifications. I know we've talked about this over and over again, but that's like one of a million scenarios that could go really poorly. And I don't think we're that far away from that. I'm honestly kind of amazed no one's already done it and it hasn't been headlines across the board. But what's the plan to regulate that, or is that even a regulatable problem in your mind?
I think there's a lot of surface area to worry about, or you can think about hydras and heads. I don't think we yet have a grasp on them. I will say that I've made a lot of dark predictions lately. Many of them have already come true. Like, I predicted there would be the first chatbot associated death this year, and I was correct about the year, and it's unfortunate. One of the predictions I made is that this year, which has not been shown correct yet, but there's still a lot of time, is that this would be the first year in which we'd have a major newspaper or similar headline involving prompt injection attacks. We're going to see new kinds of cyber crimes and unpredictable kinds of things, and there's just a lot of them, and I don't think we can promise that we're going to head all of them off, and this is why we need to mobilize, and why I don't think we have 5 years to wait. Like, I think we need to move now. The good thing again is that the people in the room really appreciated that.
So I guess sorry, could I ask a follow-up?
Yeah, go ahead, sir.
So my follow-up question there is, our government is based on the idea that it's fine to be slow to react, right? We purposely slow down
everybody in the
creation
room
of legislative bodies.
Everybody in the room was worried about speed of execution. Part of the reason, I'm trying to remember who made this really good point. One of the senators made a really good point, which is that the Senate is not designed to do things quickly. It's designed to make enduring decisions. And the enduring decision here, I'm putting words in their mouth, but they said something to this effect, might be to make an agency that can move faster than they can. The speed was absolutely top of mind for at least 80% of the senators.
I will have to throw in only because I'm
we
the
should probably let someone
crypto.
else.
Oh, go ahead. I just wanted to say, Gary, sorry. I have noticed in the congressional hearings regarding like blockchain and crypto, but I have seen that the congressional participants have seemed to accelerate it in terms of their understanding and competency. So I think that's a really good thing for our government. I just wanted to point that out. But I want
They
to go to
know this is
Strange.
important.
Go ahead.
They know this is important. You could tell it. Their remarks were well prepared, and something that other people in the room, it was a little hard for me to focus on this as much as other people in the room, but everybody else in the room that I spoke to noticed how much that senators were listening. I talked to some staffers after the fact, and they never saw the other senators sit through a whole session. I guess what they usually do is, they come in, they make the remarks, they go, and there were a number of senators that stayed the whole time, not speaking, not trying to, be in the limelight, but just trying to understand this. And that's very heartening.
Gary, I wanted to ask a question. By the way, thank you so much for sharing your views and agree with your insights on Sam. I was lucky that I was part of a VC firm like a decade ago where we invested in Looped, one of his former companies. It didn't work out as well as OpenAI, but I was not involved with the deal at all, but I did spend some time with him. And I think the media does portray some of his things unfairly. I think he cares a lot about sort of the human condition the way that Elon does, in the sense that, he wants to, focus on fusion and things like that. So I kind of agree with you, having spent a little bit of time, not a lot, but I think it's great to see what's happening. Um, Question on your congressional hearing. I loved what you talked about with the FDA, like comparisons to having some oversight board. And it's really interesting to hear that people were engaged. I agree with what Digital was just saying. But the question that I have for you is um, actually kind of two-part. What does the engagement, what do you think it's going to translate to, right? And I'll draw the analogy of, we haven't talked that much about the EU amended AI Act that happened the other day. And what's some of the stuff that's in there is just wild, right? Like it's almost like AI entrepreneurs, if they're really serious, should probably leave the EU, because, the people who made the EU AI amended act don't really seem to understand how AI generally works. And even people like Paul Graham are saying, hey, EU companies who are focused on AI should probably just, head out and move elsewhere. So what's like the risk of potential misregulation? I don't even call it overregulation, but misguided regulation because of the great interest, right? I mean, on the crypto side, Gary Gensler, I think all of us Web3 folks were actually kind of excited because Gary Gensler, taught Web3 and he seemed to understand the blockchain space. So he seemed to know it. So we're all like, oh, great, we have somebody who's an insider who's going to be on the regulatory side. Turns out an insider isn't always the best thing, right? So I'm curious about, how this interest, how it's going to manifest, into potential regulation, and what the risk of misregulation